The wind howled over the river Seine, carrying with it the scent of war, smoke, sweat, and the iron tang of blood. The Viking fleet, a monstrous assembly of longships with carved dragon heads, sailed swiftly toward the towering walls of Paris. The sky was streaked with dawn's first light, a crimson warning of the storm to come. Rollo stood at the prow of his ship, gripping the railings tightly. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched. This was his moment, the moment that, in another life, he would have betrayed his people for land, for power, for security. But this time he had made a different choice. Instead of standing among the Franks as a future Duke of Normandy, he stood among his own kin. Beside him, Ragnar Lothbrok, his legendary brother, flashed a toothy grin. "I thought the Franks had softened." "You, Rollo?" Ragnar teased, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Did their fine wines and soft women not lure you away?" Rollo turned his gaze from the approaching city to his brother. "No throne can change what I am, Ragnar. I am Viking. I will die Viking." Ragnar studied him for a long moment, then let out a booming laugh. He clapped Rollo's shoulder. "Then let's burn Paris to the ground together." The war horns blew. Across the fleet, shields were raised, axes gripped, and warriors prepared to carve their names into history. The siege of Paris had begun. The war drums of the Northmen thundered across the Seine, shaking the very air with their ominous rhythm. Rollo stood at the bow of his longship, the carved dragon head beside him seeming to snarl toward the great walls of Paris. His fingers flexed around the leather grip of his axe as the tide of battle surged toward them. From the walls, Frankish archers lined up in perfect formation, their bows raised, their orders sharp and precise. The first volley of arrows whistled through the sky like a flock of black birds. Rollo lifted his shield, bracing himself as the deadly rain clattered against the Viking defenses. "Hold!" Ragnar's voice boomed from the ship beside him. His warriors snarled like caged beasts, eager to unleash their fury. Paris stood like an impenetrable stone fortress, its high walls defying the sheer force of the Viking fleet. But Rollo knew one truth. Walls were not eternal. They could fall just like kings. The ship struck the riverbanks with a deep, resounding crash. Viking warriors leapt from their vessels, wading through knee-deep water, roaring like wild animals as they charged toward the gates. Battering rams, ladders, and siege weapons were dragged from the ships, prepared for the brutal assault. "With me!" Rollo bellowed, his voice shaking the air. He sprinted forward, his boots splashing through the blood-stained waters, his axe raised high. He was not a man of words, he was a man of war. His warriors, his brothers, his kin, they followed him without hesitation. The first clash of steel rang out like thunder. The battle had begun. The first wave of Vikings slammed into the gates of Paris like a tidal wave of fury. Axes crashed against wooden barricades, spears thrust through gaps in the defenses, and the scent of blood thickened the air. The city's defenders, armored in chainmail and steel, fought with desperation. But they were not warriors born of the frozen seas. Rollo swung his massive axe in a deadly arc, splitting a Frankish soldier's helmet like a ripe fruit. Blood sprayed across his face, but he did not slow down. Another soldier lunged at him with a sword. Rollo caught the blade with his shield, twisting his body to drive his axe into the man's ribs. One down, 100 more to go. Beside him, Ragnar fought like a man possessed, laughing between strikes, his twin axes flashing in the pale morning light. "They are weak, brother," he shouted, hacking down another enemy. "Paris will be ours before nightfall." But the Franks had prepared. From above, great cauldrons of boiling oil were tipped over the walls, pouring down in waves of fire. The Vikings below screamed as flesh melted from bone. Rollo barely rolled away in time, the heat searing his face. And then, boulders, massive chunks of stone hurled from catapults, came crashing down on the battlefield. One shattered a Viking war machine, another crushed a dozen warriors beneath its weight. Rollo growled in frustration. This wasn't going to be as easy as Ragnar thought. "We need to break the gates," he roared. He grabbed a group of warriors and pointed toward the siege rams still being dragged from the ships. "Shield wall! Protect the men pushing the ram!" The berserkers answered his call, forming a near-impenetrable shield wall as the battering ram was brought forth. Boom! The first strike against the massive wooden gate sent a deep echo through the city. The Franks scrambled to reinforce their defenses. Boom! The gates splintered. Boom! A section of the wood cracked open, and suddenly the Northmen surged forward like hungry wolves smelling weakness. Paris would fall, but not yet. The battering ram crashed against the massive wooden gates once more, sending splinters flying like arrows in all directions. The Vikings roared in triumph as cracks began to snake across the thick wood. Behind the shield wall, warriors pushed forward relentlessly, their sweat mixing with the blood pooling on the ground. Rollo wiped his brow, his face streaked with dirt and crimson. He knew the gates were close to breaking, but the Franks were not done fighting. From the ramparts, archers continued their assault, loosing arrows into the Viking ranks with deadly precision. One of Rollo's men, a young warrior barely past his first raid, took an arrow to the throat. He staggered, dropping his axe as he clutched at his neck, choking on blood. Rollo gritted his teeth but did not falter. War showed no mercy. "Keep pushing!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The gates are ours." Boom! Another strike. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of the Viking siege, barely holding together. The Franks inside were desperately piling up barrels and debris against the gates, trying to reinforce them, but it was too late. Boom! With a final deafening crack, the gates of Paris shattered. A flood of Northmen poured into the opening like a raging river. Rollo was the first through. He leaped over the broken wood, his axe raised high, his roar sending shivers through the defenders' spines. The Frankish soldiers inside scrambled to form a line, but their movements were sloppy, their panic evident. They were not ready for this kind of war. Ragnar was right behind him, laughing like a madman. "Ah, brother, do you smell that?" He took in a deep breath. Victory! But Rollo wasn't smiling. He had fought too many battles to assume it was over. He scanned the city streets, his warrior instincts screaming that something was wrong, and then he saw it. A second wall, thick stone, reinforced, looming behind the first layer of defenses. The Franks had been ready for a breach. They hadn't put all their trust in the wooden gates. This was a trap. "Fall back!" Rollo roared. "It's not over yet!" But Ragnar was already too deep into the city, leading warriors forward. The Franks were waiting. From the second wall, hidden archers suddenly emerged, unleashing a deadly storm of arrows. Dozens of Vikings fell in an instant. And then came the cavalry. From the side streets, Frankish knights on armored horses charged into the Vikings, their lances like the fangs of a great beast. The first line of Northmen was caught off guard, skewered before they could react. Rollo cursed under his breath. This was no ordinary battle. This was a deadly game of strategy, and the Franks had just made their move. But Rollo was not a man who lost games. He tightened his grip on his axe and raised his shield, ready to turn the tide once more. Paris would fall, one way or another. The battle had spilled into the streets of Paris like an uncontrollable wildfire. Steel clashed, war cries echoed, and blood painted the cobblestones as the Northmen fought against the Frankish defenders. But this was no ordinary city sack. This was a trap, and now the Vikings had to fight not just for victory, but for survival. Rollo dodged a lance meant for his chest, rolling to the side as a Frankish knight thundered past him on horseback. The knight turned for another charge, his sword raised high. Rollo was ready this time. As the horse came galloping toward him, he planted his feet, gripping his axe with both hands. At the last moment, he swung low and hard, the blade cleaving through the horse's front legs. The beast let out a pained shriek, collapsing forward, sending its rider tumbling to the ground. Before the night could rise, Rollo drove his axe down into his skull, splitting the man's helmet in two. The fight was brutal, but it was far from over. "Ragnar!" he bellowed, searching the chaos for his brother. Ragnar was further ahead, leading a reckless charge toward the second wall, his warriors fighting like rabid wolves to push forward. Arrows rained down from above, but Ragnar did not slow. He thrived in chaos. But even Ragnar had weaknesses. Rollo saw it before his brother did, a unit of Frankish pikemen forming up in the narrow streets ahead, shields locked, spears braced. If Ragnar and his men kept pushing forward, they would be cut down before they even reached the second wall. There was no time to hesitate. Rollo turned to the nearest group of Vikings still holding the entrance. "With me!" he roared. "We break their line, or we die here!" The warriors rallied, their bloodied weapons still firm in their grips. With a single motion they surged forward, crashing into the enemy ranks like a hammer striking iron. Rollo led the charge, his axe hacking through shields and flesh alike. A spear scraped against his side, tearing through his armor, but he barely felt it. Pain was nothing. Pain was for men who feared death. He did not fear death. The Frankish line began to buckle. Their discipline, their order, it was nothing against the sheer brutality of the Vikings. Their shields cracked, their spears wavered, and then Ragnar was among them, laughing as he buried an axe into a soldier's chest. "Brother, I was wondering when you'd stop playing with the horses." Rollo only grunted. "You were walking into a trap. And yet," Ragnar grinned, "here I am." The Vikings had broken through, but the second wall loomed ahead. The Franks still held the higher ground, and now the king of Francia himself, Charles the Bald, was sending his elite guards to crush the invaders once and for all. The true test was about to begin. Paris was not beaten yet. The second wall of Paris stood tall and unbroken, looming over the blood-soaked streets below. Behind it, King Charles the Bald's personal guard, an elite force of Frankish knights and heavily armored. Warriors waited, their polished steel glinting in the firelight. They were the last line of defense between the Vikings and total victory. Rollo wiped the blood from his axe, his breath heavy from the relentless battle. Around him, the Northmen regrouped, standing among the corpses of the slaughtered Frankish defenders. Ragnar, standing nearby, grinned like a man who had already won. "I wonder how much Charles values his city," he mused, tossing an enemy's severed head aside. "Do you think he'll surrender?" Rollo was not so sure. He had seen kings break before, but he had also seen kings fight to the last breath. And the fact that Charles still had his best warriors waiting behind the second wall meant he wasn't done fighting yet. As if in answer, the great iron gates of the second wall creaked open, and the king's guard surged forward. The first wave of Frankish knights charged, their massive war horses pounding across the stone streets, their lances aimed at the Viking ranks. The Northmen barely had time to raise their shields before the impact hit like a crashing wave. Rollo braced himself. The force of the impact sent men flying, shields splintering, bones breaking. A knight's lance grazed Rollo's shoulder, tearing through his armor, but he twisted at the last moment, avoiding a fatal blow. He grabbed the nearest knight by the arm, yanking him from his saddle and smashing his axe into the man's exposed neck. Blood sprayed across his chest. The tide of battle was shifting again. "Break the charge!" Rollo roared, swinging his axe in wide, savage arcs. "Take down the horses!" The Vikings, realizing the advantage, began targeting the horses, hacking at their legs with axes and spears. The streets of Paris became a graveyard of fallen steeds and their riders. But the Frankish knights were not finished. As the cavalry collapsed, their foot soldiers pushed in behind them, forming an impenetrable wall of shields and spears. The Vikings, now surrounded, had no choice but to fight their way through. Ragnar, never one to fear death, led the counterattack, his twin axes spinning like the blades of a storm. "Kill them all," he bellowed. The fighting was brutal. A Frankish knight lunged at Rollo, his sword aiming for his throat. But Rollo ducked, countering with a crushing blow to the man's ribs, sending him crumpling to the ground, gasping for breath. The Vikings were pushing forward, inch by inch, but the second wall still stood, and then, from the ramparts above, a new sound echoed through the battlefield, a horn, a signal. Rollo turned just in time to see something that made his blood turn cold. From behind the second wall, more Frankish reinforcements were pouring into the city, thousands of fresh troops, heavily armored and ready to crush the invaders once and for all. The Vikings were now trapped between the King's Guard and an incoming army. Ragnar's grin faltered for the first time. "Well, brother," he muttered, gripping his weapons tighter, "it seems we might die here after all." Rollo refused to accept defeat. Not yet. Not while Paris was still within his grasp. The battle was far from over. The war horns of the Franks echoed across the battlefield, their deep, mournful sound signaling the arrival of fresh reinforcements. From behind the second wall, thousands of Frankish soldiers marched into the streets, their armor glinting under the blood-red sky. The Vikings were surrounded. Rollo's fingers tightened around his axe. His chest heaved from exhaustion, but he knew there was no turning back now. They had come too far to die like trapped animals. Ragnar stood beside him, watching as the enemy closed in. His usual reckless grin was replaced with something more dangerous, a look of determination. "It seems the gods want to see what we're made of, brother," Ragnar muttered, his knuckles white against the handles of his axes. "Shall we show them?" Rollo let out a deep breath. This was it, do or die. "We fight," he growled. "We fight until the last man." The Frankish forces rushed forward, their spears glinting, their war cries rising over the city. The Vikings roared, in answer, refusing to be broken. The battle erupted once more. Rollo charged headfirst into the enemy ranks, his axe swinging like a force of nature. He buried the blade deep into a soldier's chest, then ripped it free in time to parry another attacker. Blood coated his arms, his legs, his face, but he did not stop. Nearby, Ragnar was a whirlwind of death, his twin axes moving faster than the eye could follow. He ducked under a spear thrust, severed the soldier's hand, then kicked him into the mud before finishing him off. The Vikings fought like madmen, but the enemy numbers were overwhelming. For every Frank they cut down, two more seemed to take their place, and then disaster struck. A blow to Rollo's side sent him staggering, pain exploding through his ribs. A Frankish knight, taller and broader than the others, stood over him, sword raised high for the killing strike. Rollo rolled to the side at the last second, dodging the blade as it slammed into the stone where he had been standing. Before the knight could recover, Rollo lunged forward, grabbing him by the throat and driving his axe into the gap between his breastplate and shoulder. The knight let out a strangled cry, blood gushing from his mouth as Rollo pushed him aside. But the pain in his ribs was bad. He could feel something broken inside him. And then he heard it. Ragnar's roar of pain. Rollo spun around just in time to see his brother fall to one knee, an arrow buried deep in his thigh. Frankish soldiers rushed him, hacking at him with their swords, their blades tearing through his armor, cutting into his flesh. "Ragnar!" Rollo bellowed, ploughing through the enemy ranks to reach his fallen brother. But there were too many. The Franks closed in, shields locking together, driving the Vikings back step by step. Rollo saw it now. They couldn't win this fight. Not like this. If they stayed, they would all die here, like dogs in the mud. They had to retreat. But could he convince Ragnar to run, or would this be the day the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok ended? The streets of Paris were drowning in blood. The cries of the dying echoed against the towering walls, mixing with the clash of steel and the heavy drumbeat of approaching Frankish reinforcements. Rollo's breath came in ragged gasps. His ribs burned like fire, but he had no time to care. Ragnar was down, and the enemy was closing in. Ragnar, ever the warrior, gritted his teeth against the pain of the arrow buried in his thigh. Blood pooled beneath him, but his grip on his axes never wavered. He lashed out, cutting down an approaching knight even as another spear scraped against his shoulder armor. Rollo barreled through the Frankish soldiers, his axe carving a path toward his wounded brother. 3 men fell in seconds, their bodies collapsing like broken dolls. "Get up!" Rollo roared, gripping Ragnar's arm. Ragnar grinned through bloodied teeth. "It seems I may have been too bold, brother." Rollo growled in frustration. There was no time for jokes. The Franks were surrounding them, their shields locking in tight formations. The Viking forces were dwindling, their numbers stretched too thin. Rollo looked around. They couldn't win. Not here, not now. "We fall back," Rollo ordered, gripping Ragnar and pulling him to his feet. "If we stay, we die." Ragnar tried to shake him off. "We can still—" "No!" Rollo snapped, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We retreat, or your sons will have to fight without a father." That gave Ragnar pause. His sons, Bjorn, Ubbe, Vitzek, Ivar, they still needed him. His legacy wasn't meant to end here, bleeding in the streets of a city that would never remember his name. "Fine," he muttered, wiping blood from his brow. "But I will not run." "You can barely walk," Rollo said, but there was no time to argue. The Vikings were breaking apart, their warriors scattering into side streets, trying to escape the tightening noose. "Shield wall!" Rollo shouted, gathering the nearest warriors to form a protective circle around Ragnar. The Franks pushed in. From all sides, swords and spears clashed against the Viking shields. The roar of warriors and the screams of the dying filled the air. And then, in the distance, the horns of retreat. From the riverbanks, Viking longships signaled the call to withdraw. Those who could escape were already fleeing toward the ships, pushing through the city gates before they were sealed shut forever. Rollo gritted his teeth. They had lost the battle, but they could still survive to fight another day. "Move!" he commanded, dragging Ragnar forward as their warriors fought tooth and nail to clear a path. A spear whizzed past Rollo's ear, barely missing him. He turned just in time to parry a sword thrust, his axe biting deep into the attacker's shoulder. Another knight charged him, but a Viking warrior, one of his best men, stepped in the way, taking the blow meant for Rollo. "Go, my Jarl!" The dying man gasped, blood spilling from his lips. Rollo hesitated for half a second, then nodded in respect before pulling Ragnar toward the open streets. The Vikings rushed toward the river, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Behind them, the second wall of Paris still stood untouched. The city was not theirs, not this time. As Rollo pushed Ragnar onto a longship, he looked back one last time. The city still burned, the battle still raged, but the war was far from over. This was not defeat, this was a lesson, and the next time Rollo returned to Paris, he would not leave without its crown. The Viking fleet drifted away from the burning city of Paris, their ships cutting through the dark waters of the Seine like wounded beasts retreating from battle. Smoke curled into the sky behind them, the scent of blood and fire clinging to their armor like a curse. Rollo stood at the stern of his ship, his fists clenched, his face hard as stone. He had never run from a fight before, not like this. Defeat was a bitter taste on his tongue. Ragnar, sitting nearby with his wounded leg stretched before him, watched his brother with tired eyes. Despite the pain, his lips curled into a smirk. "You look like a man who just lost his honor," Ragnar said. Rollo's jaw tightened. "We should have won. We still breathe, brother. That is enough." Ragnar stretched, wincing as the arrow wound. In his thigh throbbed. Paris was stronger than we expected, but that only means one thing. Rollo finally turned to him. And what is that? Ragnar's grin turned sharp, dangerous. We return. The crew around them fell silent, listening to their king's words. The fire in Ragnar's eyes was contagious, spreading like an unspoken command through the weary warriors. But Rollo was not so easily soothed. We were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. He growled, and next time they will be even more prepared. Then next time we bring more men, Ragnar said simply. Rollo exhaled sharply, his breath misting in the cold air. And what of King Charles? He will expect us to come back. He will fortify the city even more. Let him, Ragnar said. It does not matter how high a man builds his walls. In the end, he must come out to fight. The words rang true, but Rollo was no longer just a warrior who followed. He had spent years living in his brother's shadow, always the one who fought, but never the one who decided the path forward. But this time, things felt different. This time, Rollo wasn't going to just follow Ragnar's plan. He was going to make his own, and Paris would be his. The long winter passed in the north, but Rollo never forgot the taste of defeat. While others raided smaller villages and spent their gold on wine and women, Rollo trained. He gathered men, warriors who had no kings, no masters, only the desire for glory. When spring arrived, Ragnar was ready to return to Paris. But this time, Rollo had his own plan, and for the first time he would not just fight for his brother's war. This time, he would fight for himself. The Viking fleet returned to Paris, larger and more fearsome than before. Hundreds of longships filled the Seine, their dragon-headed prows gleaming under the morning sun. The warriors on board were not just raiders. They were an army ready to finish what had begun a year ago. This time, Rollo was not just Ragnar's brother. He was a warlord in his own right. He had spent the past year gathering the strongest, most ruthless warriors he could find. Men with no kings, no lords, only the desire for battle. And they followed him, not Ragnar. As the ships approached, the mighty walls of Paris stood unbroken just as before. But Rollo had studied them well. He knew their weaknesses, and he knew how to break them. The Franks were waiting this time. Their archers lined the walls, their catapults ready. King Charles had fortified the city even more, placing barricades along the streets. But Rollo had come prepared. Instead of a direct attack on the walls, he led a small group of warriors under cover of darkness the night before. They had scaled the cliffs near the rear of the city, unseen by the guards. And now, as the Viking army attacked the front gates, Rollo and his men emerged from within the city itself. The trap was set. The Franks, expecting a siege, never saw the attack from within. The second gate, the true heart of Paris, fell within hours. Rollo, his axe stained with Frankish blood, stood at the center of the chaos. The city was burning, the streets flooded with the dead. Ragnar found him amid the destruction, his face filled with pride and something else. "You did this," Ragnar said, looking around at the ruined city. "This victory is yours, brother." Rollo, breathing hard, looked toward the great palace of King Charles, where the cowards still hid. And then he made his decision. He did not burn the palace. He did not kill the king. Instead, he demanded something greater than blood, a crown. He would take the land not as a conqueror, but as a ruler. He would make Paris his home, and this time he would not betray his people to do it. Ragnar watched him for a long time, then nodded. "Perhaps," he murmured, "you were always meant to be more than a warrior." Rollo turned to him, his face unreadable. "And perhaps," he said, "you were always meant to be something more than a king." Ragnar laughed, shaking his head. "We shall see, brother." And as the raven banners flew over Paris, as the city fell not just to Vikings, but to Rollo himself, history changed forever. For in this world, Rollo did not betray the Vikings. But in the end, he still became a king. And that made all the difference.